Paul+Krugman is in the news. Well, he's always in the news because he writes for the New York Times, right? You know what? With his beard, some of you have said I look like Paul+Krugman. A much handsomer version, of course, but I think the beard does make me look scholarly. Anyway, Paul+Krugman, he writes for the New York Times. By the way, it makes me laugh when people, they come to me and they say, I read the New York Times. And they say that kind of like, wanting to show me that they're very intelligent and informed. And I just laugh. I laugh because the New York Times is a rag sheet. It is a propaganda rag sheet. And the same can be said for the Wall Street Journal. If you read the Wall Street Journal and if you think you're getting informed about economics or even markets, I mean, you are totally kidding yourself. All right, I stopped reading the Wall Street Journal like probably 30 years ago. So anyway, Krugman, back in October, he writes this article, and that was when Hillary looked like a lock to win the presidency. And he writes this article like, don't pay any attention to the deficit scolds. The deficit scolds, he calls them. People like Pete Peterson and David Walker and all these people who are constantly worried about the deficit. Because, he's right. The deficit is meaningless. The deficit of a government that issues its own currency where all of its liabilities are denominated in its own currency. I mean, the deficit is equal but opposite to, in other words, the deficit of the government equals the surplus of the non-government, the private sector, here domestically and rest of the world combined. So in other words, if the government spends more than its income, that spending flows to the non-government, and that comprises their income and savings. They're equal but opposite by definition. It's just sheer accounting, okay? So he's right. When he was saying in this article, hey, when Hillary gets elected, she should come in, do a massive national investment in national infrastructure, in healthcare, in education, in transportation, all the things we need, and it should be paid for with deficit spending. Absolutely correct. I'm totally on board with that idea. That's how we fought World War II. That's how Eisenhower built the interstate highway system. That's how we put men on the moon. And more recently, that's how we got out of the Great Recession, the Great Financial Crash. The deficit went up to 1.5 trillion. That was the highest nominal deficit in history. It wasn't the biggest as a percentage of GDP. It was still pretty big. It was about 10%. But it was a huge deficit, and it turned the economy around. Okay? And he said that's what she should do. I totally agree. Now, just the other day, he flips around and he says deficits do matter. And of course, why is he saying that? Because Trump got elected, and Trump is talking about this big fiscal stimulus, which may or may not happen. But anyway, Krugman is attacking it, right? And he's attacking it, and he's saying if all the opposite of the things he said. He said if he does the fiscal stimulus, if he runs a deficit, then it's going to, crowd out private investment. This idea of crowding out, that if the government spends, then there's not going to be any money for the rest of us, which is completely ludicrous, completely ridiculous. Because again, a government that spends with its own currency, which it has the monopoly power to issue, and where all of its liabilities are denominated in its own currency, that spending adds to the income and the savings of the private sector. So it helps them to invest. And as a matter of fact, if you look at any chart, and I don't have the charts here, but you can go to a place like the St. Louis Fred database. You look that up and you could see in that last period I spoke about, when the deficit went to 1.5 trillion, gross private domestic investment, exactly what Krugman is talking about, that thing zoomed through the roof. It was like a moonshot how that went up, okay? And conversely, if you're looking at that chart, you'll see that in the period when Clinton, famously ran his surpluses, which everyone thinks is so virtuous, that caused gross private domestic investment to roll over and eventually collapse. We went into, that 2007, 8, 9 financial crisis and crash. So the proof is right there. It's the amazing thing about this stuff is that, it's not like I went out and I found some secret data which nobody knows about. And I made these charts. It's all there. It's all there. And he knows it. Krugman knows it. And that's why economics, that's why it sucks as a discipline. It's not a science. You can't do that with math or physics, kind of corrupt the, shape shift the outcome, the narrative. You can't do that. It is what it is. But economics is not a science, despite all the attempts to do all this fancy math with it. It's not a science. It's probably not even it's like a part of politics, is what it is. By the way, Krugman, in that same article the other day, he also said that if the deficit goes up, then interest rates are going to go way, way up. And again, he knows this. He knows this. That in a situation, again, of a country that issues its own currency, where all its liabilities are denominated in that currency, the government, or the government's bank, the central bank, sets the interest rate. That's why we all sit around every month, every time the Fed meets, and wait to see what they decide to set it at. And you could look at a chart, again, go to that Fred database, and you'll see not only is there not a correlation between the deficit and the overall debt, but it's actually an inverse correlation. In other words, the higher the deficit goes, the lower the interest rate is. Just because you're supplying all those funds to the economy, and that actually makes the cost of money go down. The natural rate of interest, understand this now, the natural rate of interest for a currency issuing nation where its liabilities are denominated in its own currency, the natural rate of interest is zero, okay? It takes work, it takes effort, it's artificial to have a positive rate. The natural rate is zero. Now, if we were in a gold standard or if we were on a fixed exchange rate regime, then Krugman would be correct. But he's totally not correct. He's completely disingenuous because he knows what's true and what's not true. And he knows that back in October when he said deficits don't matter, that also applies right now. It applies to right now. Now, I don't know, necessarily if Trump understands this, and he's surrounded himself with a team of fiscal hawks. And none of those guys understand it, I can assure you. So we don't know what the outcome is going to be. But Krugman, you're bad. You are bad. Just wanted to put that out there. Bye.